All right, let's get going. A very warm welcome on behalf of the co-organizers of this event. My name is Oliver Schmidtke. I'm directing the Center for Global Studies, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you all to this session. We thought, given the upcoming elections in 2 weeks, it would be appropriate to take stock of what we're going to face under different scenarios as an outcome of the election. And as much as we are not able to predict the outcome, we might have a clue of what the effects of these elections and a possible Trump or Biden administration will be. And arguably, as some commentators have underlined, there's a lot at stake here. Some people would even argue that the very vitality of American democracy is at risk. For sure, what we could already predict is the effects on the international community of either administration. And if you look back what has happened over the past 4 years under the Trump administration, one of the key pillars of the post-World War period has come under increasing pressures, which is multilateralism as a commitment to address issues of security and political economic stability from a collaborative perspective. So although, and that might be the paradox that we're going to look at today, assessing the effects of the elections domestically, but also how it relates to the international arena, there's a certain paradox, because under Trump, we've seen a real tendency to look at domestic issues primarily. The America First policy indicated a new isolationist approach to international affairs, and arguably there's not much interest in the current electoral debate on international affairs. At the same time, and that's a paradox you could argue, the elections will have a tremendous impact on issues of global international concern. Just think about the fight against the global pandemic, issue of the environment, the Paris Accord, the global trade agreements. You have a whole list of issues that will be majorly affected by the outcome of this election. So Stephanie, if you can go to the next slide. What we decided to do as a co-initiative of the Center for Asia Pacific Studies, the Victoria Forum, and the Center for Global Studies have a series of events, starting with today, looking at the US election and its global impact. And today, our main focus is on the intersection between the domestic arena, the electoral campaigns, what candidates, how candidates have positioned themselves, what issues have played a major role, and the global international arena. On the 13th of November, we will do a debrief and looking more closely at issues of global affairs and what we will expect, we'll be able to expect under different scenarios that the elections will produce. And then there is the plan for a third panel done through COPY that will look at the US elections and Southeast Asia. So that will still be announced. So just to give you the heads up of what is coming, and this is in a way the first step in a 3-part series on considering the impact of the US election. Before I start, hand it over to my colleague from COPY, Victor Ramraj, let me give you a couple of housekeeping suggestions for the next slide. Oh, sorry, before we start off, importantly, although this is a virtual meeting, we would like to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Singye, Esquimalt, and the Sanish peoples whose historical relationship with the land continue to this day. With this acknowledgement of the land where the university operates and where most of us meet today, let me come to the housekeeping items. You're probably all familiar now with Zoom rules, so just to quickly go over them, please stay muted and having your camera off while we're in session, while the presentation takes place. After this, you will have the chat function to type in your question. We'll see whether we ask you to unmute your mic and start your camera, but essentially the chat function is in the box is where we going to collect questions, and then the moderators will pose them to our panelists. Also, this presentation will be recorded, so just the heads up that we will make the recording available On the next slide, you see both the Center for Global Studies and CAPI, the Center for Asian Pacific Initiatives, will have this recording made available for their respective audiences. So thank you for your patience in this respect. With this, I would like to hand it over to Victor Ramraj, who will start introducing our panelists and lead us into the discussion. So Victor, over to you.
Thanks, Oliver, and very good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone. As Oliver says, we have 4 distinguished panelists to help us navigate our way through the issues, and I'll just say a few words about them and invite them to provide some additional background when they start their remarks to explain the perspective that they bring to the issues for discussion today. So first we have Professor Colin Bennett. He's a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Victoria. And Colin happens to be teaching a course this semester on the US election. And his research interests include information and privacy law. I'm going to change the order from what you see on the screen. Our second speaker will be Jill Horwitz, who is, as you can see, the Vice Dean at UCLA's School of Law. She's a professor of law there, and she's also an adjunct professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Victoria. Her areas include health law and policy. Next, we have Susan Breau, who is a dean and professor of law at the University of Victoria. She is interested in international law and multilateralism, and in particular does research on international humanitarian law. And last but not least, but certainly furthest away from us physically today, is Michael Peil, who is the Vice Dean at the Jigme Singye Wangchuck School of Law in Bhutan. Michael is also a professor of international law, and he moved to Bhutan from the Washington University of St. Louis some years ago. So it's absolutely wonderful to have you all here. I'm delighted and excited for this panel. The plan is, and we've asked the speakers to speak to us, essentially working from inside the United States and starting inside the United States and working our way out, essentially, although everybody is going to be talking about the intersection between domestic issues and international issues. I've asked everyone to speak for roughly 5 minutes, and then we'll get into moderated discussion. And in the spirit of the US election, I do, as moderator, have the power to mute everybody's microphone. So with that, I will hand the floor over to Colin Bennett to kick us off. Colin.
Okay, thank you, Victor. Thank you, Oliver. Thank you for the Center for Global Studies and CAPI. Yeah, as Victor mentioned, I am teaching 2 classes at the moment, 2 sections on US politics on the elections. So I'm in the middle of these issues, and as you can imagine, the students are engaged. My role is to say something about the current state of the US election as I see it, and then link up to 2 or 3 global questions that the other panelists can address. I'm not an international relations scholar, but I'm a political scientist, and political scientists have been analyzing US voting behavior for a very, very long time. And I've got lots of theories about it, and pretty much every one of those theories would point to a Biden victory. That's not a prediction, that's just I don't know what it is. It's an extrapolation. Let's put it that way. He has a consistent lead in the polls over the last year, average 7 to 9%. That's pretty stable, including in the competitive states, including in some states like Georgia, North Carolina, Texas, Ohio, that Trump won pretty well last time, forcing Trump to spend money there. Biden has a lot more money than has Trump over the last 2 weeks. He's better liked, he's more popular. He's better on the issue that is at the forefront of everybody's mind at the moment, namely COVID. The demographics are in his favor. And from what we know about mail-in voting, the vast majority of people who have already voted by mail in some of those critical swing states are disproportionately registered Democrats. So all that points in one direction. However, there is a however. There are voter suppression techniques being waged on social media and in other places in many states. There's a lot of litigation about mail-in balloting by the Republicans. There's evidence of successful Republican registration drives, as the Republicans have been a little more cavalier about door-to-door registration drives than have the Democrats, and they have registered more voters in Florida and Pennsylvania. There's also this worry about a repeat of 2016 and that the polls were not capturing white, non-college educated male voters. We're told that the polling has adjusted for those failures last time. We'll wait and see. And also remember that the president is the president is the president, and the president has the power to do things as president, which can alter the contours of this election a great deal. I point, for example, to the recent announcement about a potential nuclear deal between the United States and Russia. So there's a distinct possibility that Biden could win. There's a distinct possibility that he could win big. There's a distinct possibility that the Democrats could control the Senate. There's a distinct possibility that the Electoral College would have done its job in accentuating the power of the person who wins the popular vote and giving him an exaggerated mandate. There's a distinct possibility that litigation over mail-in ballots will be irrelevant. There's a distinct possibility that, of course, Trump will whine and tweet, but also that his supporters will dump him like a hot potato. His power does not come from the fact that people like him, it comes from the fact that they fear him. And as soon as he doesn't have power, they will likely drop him pretty quickly. And of course, some of them will prepare for presidential runs in 2024. And if that all happens, of course, we'll all have to endure patronizing lectures from our friends south of the border about how resilient the US Constitution is after all. And so we'll be back to the kind of old normal. That said, I want to say two things about global affairs. I think I've got a minute, Victor. Looking at Biden's messaging about global affairs, I think it's important to note that he does not really separate out the international relations of this election from the domestic politics. He is deeply, deeply, deeply concerned about America's image around the world. He's deeply concerned about prestige, about respect, about trust, about leadership. And I think instinctively he is a multilateralist, to use Oliver's phrase. I mean, he remembers the successes of the past. He's been in American politics for a long time, and he knows how good diplomacy works and how good agreements can, in fact, make the world a better place to live in. That said, he's also been saying some very protectionist things about American workers in the upper Midwest, and he's saying that directly to appeal to those white working class voters that were attracted to Trump. So we're not going to see any kind of renegotiation of those trade deals, I don't think. He's making those statements. So that's my first point. The second point is this. The deficit in 2020 is $3 trillion and counting. That's even without the new stimulus package that is being negotiated, we hope, right now. That is an enormous amount of money. Republicans used to be very, very concerned about debt and deficit. They're saying absolutely nothing about it now, it seems. Something's got to give with that level of deficit. Something's got to give. It's probably not going to be discretionary programs. It's not going to be entitlements. There's only so much of that you can recoup from taxing billionaires and people over $400,000, which is what Biden has said. So I wonder whether or not one thing that will give, and this I think would make the world and perhaps the United States a better place, is the defense budget, which is bloated. And if that occurs, then I think that would have also a significant effect on America's role in the world and its global position. Thank you, Victor. I tried to keep to 5 minutes. I don't know whether I did, but that's it.
Thanks very much, Colin. And in 5 minutes, you managed to give us the background, set the stage. So thank you very much for that. And with that, I'll move swiftly to Jill Horwitz. Jill, over to you.
Great, thank you. So I think I'll just make 4 introductory points, starting internally and moving internationally, and then on to talk a little bit about COVID. So this is really an existential moment for the US political system, and I mean that both in the small and in the large. So in the small, there's a question of whether we can run fair elections. Literally, can we get people to polls? Can we count their votes? I'm not as sanguine as Colin is about Texas, because, for example, a couple of days ago, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that election officials can reject mail-in ballots if the signatures on those mail-in ballots don't match the signatures on file. So that's a lot of discretion to election officials in a very partisan state. In the large, I worry that this election opens the question of the stability and prospects for the constitutional order of the US. So our system is one of checks and balances. Over the years, I've been sometimes very jealous of Canada's parliamentary system, because it seems like you can get things done. On the other hand, what we see now in the States is sort of a ramping up of what's been a long-term trend of attempts to subordinate the judiciary and legislative branches to the executive branch. And Trump has been doing that since day one, with an awful lot of help from the Senate and some parts of the judiciary. So whether our fairly young system can stay, I just don't know. Polarization is the second point, and I think in some ways it's almost trite to mention it, because that's what's been covered for years. But I think something important to note in terms of this election is that very often our federalist system has been a safety valve for polarization, and that's not working so well anymore. So if you lived in a conservative state, the state could represent your views. If you lived in a liberal state, you could be satisfied that the state would represent your views. And now we have more polarization between urban and rural areas within states. So state voting is no longer a safety valve. I'll say just a word about international affairs, since I'm really a domestic policy scholar in all respects, but we have abdicated our role in foreign affairs. A Biden presidency does not mean an automatic resumption of our role, our leadership role in the world. Our State Department has been gutted, and that project of rebuilding is an internal project that will take a long time if Biden is elected and is able to enter the White House. The rest of the world is not going to so easily let the US resume our old position of power. So I think that the empire has been in decline for a long time. And it's not going to be so easy to reclaim it after this election. We'll see whether Europe, China, Russia fills in, or if simply we're going to see more regionalism. Finally, in terms of the pandemic, I would say so much, again, is obvious. We should have been leading, we should have been cooperating. That Canada has engaged in rolling border closures says it all, right? Canada is keeping US residents out of the country because we're dangerous. Our researchers have had to spend their time battling government. So here's another example. The CDC's morbidity and mortality weekly reports have been an international standard for transparency. It's sort of a report about sickness and dying that is not touched by government. Trump has even had to undermine that. Something that has been worrying me about the COVID that might not be as obvious as withdrawing from WHO, for example, is that the US tends to put its faith in private entities, both private nonprofits and private for-profits, more than other countries. That means that we subsidize big pharma and we work with big pharma to solve crises like the one we're in right now. But the distrust is so widespread, and Trump has so sullied even those connections, that I think if we come up with a vaccine, Whether we can roll it out and get people to take it is another question. So I'll give one example of that and then move on. But think about what happened a couple of weeks ago when he was treated with Regeneron. There are videos all over the internet making fun of him for hawking Regeneron because he had investments in the country. In the company. So whether Regeneron is going to be the answer to treating COVID, I have no idea, but I sure do know that many people are going to be skeptical if it is.
Thanks very much, Jill. And I think your points reinforce the domestic perspective on those global issues. And I want to just pick up on your last point about COVID and the health crisis, because the U.S. withdrawal from the WHO, I think, speaks loudly to questions of multilateralism. And that in turn, I think, leads us to our next panelist. So let me just move things along, and we'll come back to your points in discussion. But Susan, may I invite you to join us? And you have about 5 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Victor. I want to say to everybody that although I'm a dean of a law school, my life passion is public international law. And when I went to study at the London School of Economics in 1999, at that time, I was an absolute optimist that we would see the evolution of an international constitutional system. And I remember saying to myself that one of the books that I wanted to write was an argument that there was an international constitution. Sadly, 20 years later, over 20 years later, I'm no longer as optimistic that we have an international constitution. One point I want to make initially, though, is that I don't just think that we can put all of the blame of the weakening of the international system at Donald Trump's feet. I would love to do that, but it's just not true. When you look at, I always date this from the attack on the World Trade Center in 2001. I think at that stage, there was a rise in the United States, particularly, of their own foreign policy that very much, with some justification given the attack that had occurred, that very much put America first in the international system. Now, what Trump has done, however, is just leave the party. Instead of trying to lead the international system, sometimes with not great results, like the war in Iraq in 2003, Donald Trump has just decided he wants to leave the international system altogether. And not only has he announced that in 2021, they will pull out of the WHO, they've also, there are strong rumors that Donald Trump is considering pulling out of NATO, basically dismantling the post-war peace and security system. Now, there's lots of reasons to think that the peace and security system needed changing. But what Trump has done and what we risk is that basically there's been what I call comfort to dictators. When you look at, for example, the way in which Turkey invaded Iraq and Syria to dispose of the Kurds when the United States left the region. If you look at the withdrawal from the Iran nuclear agreement, if you look at the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Change Accord, basically there is an absence of presence. And I totally agree with Jill that even though I agree with Colin that Joe Biden is a multilateralist, I think he is, it will take decades to undo this. It's going to be a long process. And Colin also mentioned the issue of the deficit. That's also going to have an impact because the United States power often was based on a great deal of funding support for countries that were battling various violations of human rights, etc. That's going to be a real issue. Finally, I want to spend my last few minutes on the pandemic. This is where, and Jill highlighted, I've been most concerned about what is happening in the United States. And again, I think a Biden administration is not going to easily be able to pivot to international leadership in the pandemic because the United States has a major crisis on its hands in dealing with the pandemic. He's going to, of course, have to focus domestically because too many people are dying in his own country. The problem with that is that the WHO, which is chronically short of funds, the catastrophe of this pandemic hasn't even begun to be seen when you think of the global south, when you think of areas that cannot afford ventilators, cannot afford ICU units. We haven't even begun to see how bad this is going to be in terms of cost of life. And without the United States being part of this international leadership, what all countries seem to have done is gone into their own respective corners. And when Jill and I talked about this before, I'm certainly aware that Canada's done the same thing, buying up vaccines. And as a multilateralist and as someone who truly believes in a global legal system, in a global international system, to see this happen when this pandemic could have been combated multilaterally with support to the WHO is an absolute tragedy. And I think a Trump regime will be catastrophic, but I'm afraid to say that a Biden regime is going to have to focus so much on a domestic crisis that multilateralism again, and Oliver said it in his introduction, may have to take a back seat. Thanks, Victor. I'll wait for conversation to go on. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Susan. That was a rather sobering account, I think meant to bring us back down to earth in terms of the prospects of a change in administration and what it promises to bring or not. Thanks for that, and let's move on swiftly to Michael. Michael, over to you.
I fear that I joined Susan in the reluctant club of former optimists when it comes to multilateralism and global constitutionalism, and that'll come as no surprise to Susan. I've been asked to talk a bit about the Asian perspective. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm not actually originally from Bhutan. I'm from the United States, but I've lived and worked here in South Asia with my family for the last 8 years. I am an avid and interested follower of politics in this region, and originally when I lived in the United States, actively and presently, but now from a distance, a very interested follower of US politics. The United States' role in East, Southeast, and South Asia has always been, of course, complicated and problematic. To put it mildly, even in the best of times, America's interests in this part of the world are, shall we say, not necessarily coincident with the best interests of India or China or Thailand or Laos or the Philippines or even Asia writ large. That being said, at its best moments, the United States has at least played a grounding role here in Asia. In the early modern era, American independence and its ideals were a rallying cry for anti-colonialists across Asia. And in the 20th century, the words of Jefferson, Martin Luther King, and many, many others were on the lips of anti-colonialists and revolutionaries across the continent. During the Cold War, American democracy and, at least on the surface, American respect for human rights were a counterbalance to the threat of global statist communism. And warts and all, American democracy at least provided an example to the nascent civil society in Asia. They might reject the conclusions that America comes to and the actions that America takes, but as Jill said, the Constitution works, the democratic process works, it's self-correcting, and respect for rule of law is the aspirational right way forward. That was the story as of November of 2016. As Susan has hinted, the last 3.5 years have changed all that. Every relationship is now transactional, and every time-tested alliance is now negotiable. Just as importantly, President Trump's behavior within America is the stuff of headlines across Asia and the stuff of debates in Parliament and on social media across the continent. Trump's behavior over the last 4 years and the craven support or silence of his Republican allies and apologists have made it clear that America's support for the rule of law, even within its own borders, is no longer a thing to be taken for granted. And with the president's fawning support of dictators across this region, America's support for the rule of law abroad no longer even shows up on the radar. I have to say, in terms of the regional discourse, this has more or less taken the rule of law off the table, at least in the countries I focus on. I'm not saying the door has been open to widespread corruption or genocidal dictators, but the old rule of law discourse has been replaced with a much more transactional, much more populist, much more short now realpolitik. In the Philippines, we see President Duterte taking a damn the human rights conventions full speed ahead approach to official corruption, drug trafficking, and a wide range of so-called antisocial crimes with the tacit and sometimes explicit support of the American administration. In India, we see the ruling BJP party consolidating a pan-Hindustani model in a country whose territory has for millennia been anything but monocultural. Again, with the support, as he and most recently his son, with the support of the American administration and the ruling family. And then, of course, there's China. And not only is there no American voice to counterbalance these examples, every one of these movements, these leaders, can point to the American president and say, I learned it from watching him. This has left the governments of the region, without a counterbalance from Washington, free to do their own thing. I mean, the Belt and Road is one example, but much more unfortunately, as we've seen along their mutual border, this is an opportunity for India and China to flex their regional muscle and push South Asia to the brink of conflict, including on our border here in Bhutan at Doklam. So I know this meeting is supposed to propose alternative futures for a second Trump presidency or a first Biden presidency, but I do join Jill and Susan in my skepticism about America's ability to resume our previous bully pulpit, even in the event that Biden wins. I fear that here in Asia, the damage has been done and in many important senses can't truly ever be undone. Trump has demonstrated that even America can simply walk away from its global commitments and from its domestic and international commitment to the constitutional order and to the rule of law. It is no longer a plausible defense for Americans to say to our colleagues, counterparts, allies, and enemies in Asia, well, the constitutional system works, it self-corrects. Perhaps even worse, Trump has drawn a path, he's drawn a map for democratically elected presidents and prime ministers and opposition movements to pursue local and pastoral ends, political and financial ends, cloaked in the name of national interest. And in many countries in my part of the world where the rule of law was already, shall we say, on a somewhat tenuous footing, the disappearance of the virtuous American voice is tremendously dangerous. Thank you, Victor. Did I come in under 5 minutes? That would be a record for me.
Well, close enough. Yeah. Thanks very much, Michael. Another sobering account. May I invite, I think everybody has, all of our panelists now have their videos on. So I'd like to start off our discussion. And Michael, I think you've given us a great springboard into that discussion, which picks up on what was said earlier. I want to just reflect for a moment on the idea of the abdication, as Jill put it, the abdication of the US's role in foreign affairs. And Michael and Susan, that's a theme that you picked up on. And also to ask, maybe to highlight a note of optimism. If Biden is elected, Susan had suggested that we might see a bit of a return to a multilateral approach. And I'm wondering, Michael, if that is the response, that even if the United States has lost its leadership role, its sort of virtuous approach to foreign affairs, that sort of leadership role that it took in decades past, that if the solution is not to join with other like-minded countries, the Canadas and New Zealands and others in a coalition, rather than thinking of it, the world in bipolar terms?
I fear that we may be in a situation, at least for the next 4 years, where the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. As Jill and Susan have both noted, not only do we have an abdication in principle, but we have a gutting of the rank and file of the US's diplomatic civil service. So that even if Biden and his team decide that they want to re-engage, including with Canada, New Zealand, other leaders in this area, I think he lacks the tools. I think that apart from the obvious emphasis we're going to have to see on domestic affairs for a long time under this administration, even if they decide to ramp back up a multilateral approach, they're going to have to rebuild a structure that takes a generation from the ground up. And so I just worry that among other things, in creating a l'état c'est moi approach to American diplomacy, Trump has also made it impossible for his successor, whether that's in 2020 or 2024, to do any different.
Do the others agree with that account, Susan?
I think I really want to point out something that Michael said, because I think it's not only true of Asia. The other problem in rebuilding the multilateral system is that a lot of states have adopted l'état et moi. Even if you look at the way the Europeans have behaved in the pandemic, the Brexit situation in the UK, this is a breakdown that, all right, we could give the US a lot of responsibility, but other states ran with it too. Russia and China, other states said, oh goody, we get to operate our own system for our own interest, and we don't have to worry about the best interest. So as you know, I write on international responsibility, Victor. I mean, where is the international responsibility? Where has it gone? And it's not just the United States where that has happened. Even in Canada, as you know, we have an uphill struggle to persuade the Canadian government to take a leadership role in these times. They haven't done so. If anything, I think Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, I would point to as someone who has. So I think there's a problem rebuilding it, not just from the United States perspective.
Victor, a couple of points, if I may.
Well, I want to, I'm going to, sure, please. Yes, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I didn't want to. I just wanted to push back a little bit on this. I mean, I think that the US involvement with the rest of the world is going to be, one, policy dependent, and two, regionally dependent. I don't think we can really categorize that relationship as multilateral or isolationist. There are some areas in which the United States is going to be more able to re-engage, and in which it is in its national interest to re-engage. So, for example, I've been doing a lot of work on cybersecurity, internet governance, and all of that. The US is deeply involved in those issues. So that's point number one. Point number two is, I think, you know, notwithstanding Trump, the United States has been in a process of relative decline, relative international decline relative to the rest of the world. And so, although I agree with you that it's going to be terribly difficult for a, you know, Biden administration to re-engage and to recapture the relationships as they were 4 or 5 years ago, I think also it's going to entail or require a rethinking of what it actually means for the United States to engage with the rest of the world when it's no longer clearly number one. And that process was going to be happening anyway. Thanks.
Jill, could I invite you? And on this end, I'm also interested in whether you think that the health, public health area is one of those areas where the U.S. will have to re-engage in a multilateral way.
You know, I want to be a little bit careful because my attention is really largely domestic in this area, or, you know, at most comparative. But I would say one of the issues we have there are a lot of people. There are a lot of people who do international affairs. They can, do some restaffing. It's not like all of Biden's attention has to be in one place or another. Should he, I don't even want to say elected, should he be able to make it to the White House, even if elected? But there's so many internal problems that are going to take expert attention. So just for an example, this conversation kind of happens internally also, the kinds of struggles we're seeing about how governments interact. So here's an example. In Massachusetts, the New England Patriots airplane had to go to China to get equipment because the federal government was taking it from the state of Massachusetts. I mean, this is just a situation that you wouldn't believe in a movie, right? And so with a federal government that is more ordinary and reasonable in its deployment of resources during a pandemic, there will be many places where that doesn't have to happen anymore, but it'll take a long time to get that trust back. On the other hand, there will be other states that will be engaged in suing the government because the governors will do things to challenge elite expert policymaking. So, we'll see a resurgence of those states suing for different reasons. So I think that things are going to be a real internal mess for a while. I mean, fortunately, in some places, what we've seen is private entities just taking over. So there are states in which hospitals, for example, were organizing their own supply sharing systems because, government couldn't do it. And so the hospitals were stepping in and having exchanges, in a place as large and powerful and functional as the United States. I mean, that's a shock.
So, Susan, I wonder if I can invite you back in to this question of the domestic pressures and the possibility of re-engaging. Do you think, are you convinced that it's not going to be as easy as that?
Well, I agree with Jill that there's certainly a lot of people, and there's been a lot of people waiting in the wings during the Trump administration to get back in. The problem is the bureaucracy takes a while to get those people back in. It will take some time, but there'll be a lot of international lawyers, policymakers who want to be part of the system. They'll be chomping at the bit to do it. So I think they can rebuild. I absolutely believe that they can rebuild the State Department. I will point out, though, that what happened with the Ukrainian ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to the Ukraine, and that staff was pretty abhorrent. I mean, there are a lot of people that got very, very turned off with diplomatic service at that stage because it became so politicized. I mean, they had death threats. I mean, people lost their livelihoods. People lost excellent careers. So it's going to take some time. I don't think it's impossible. And I do think when you look at the history of the United States, which I often teach in my international law classes, I mean, look what Franklin Delano Roosevelt did in a very short period of time. You can have an inspirational leader who can say, nope, we have to worry about the peace and security of the world. It's in our interest as the United States, and we've got to get engaged. I will say one other thing, though. Biden, at his age, he said he's only going to be a one-term president. I would hope that what he'd be doing is training up the next generation to do some of this. I doubt he'd be able to see it through himself.
Right, and I'll also just add to that trust and credibility goes both ways. It will be an effort for Biden to, not so much Biden, his Secretary of State and the civil service in the United States, to rebuild our capacity to engage with the world. And having done that, it will then be a completely second step, and this is not something that President Biden can do on his own, to rebuild the trust from the other direction. I mean, this was not just shocking for Americans. The last 4 years have not just been shocking for North Americans, but it has been shocking for the rest of the world. And all the good faith in the world and all the hard work in the world over the next 4 years will not dispel the fears of the rest of the world and the international organizations out there that, yes, 2020 to 2024 has been good, but what's our guarantee, comma, American people and American electoral system, that we won't just jerk back in the other direction in 2024?
Which is an excellent point, Michael. And I want to turn that over to Colin, because this question of rebuilding the State Department and, some policy people who look at wicked problems, right? They speak of the need for stickiness in institutions. I wonder, Colin, if there's a way of rebuilding the State Department and foreign policy related institutions, multilateral institutions in the United States, or the United States' engagement in those institutions, to make it a bit stickier. I know at the end of the Obama administration, there was an attempt to make the Paris Agreement, for instance, more difficult to extract, for the United States to extract itself from the Paris Agreement. Are there ways of entrenching a kind of a multilateralism or internationalism that might survive another change in administration?
Well, I don't know, Victor. There's a couple of big questions, and I'm not sure that my answers are equal to to them. Let me just say two things. A lot of Trump's policy choices have been made by executive order, not by treaty, not by legislation. Executive orders can be changed with a stroke of the pen. So that's point number one. Point number two, one thing to note about the Trump administration is that it was the most unsuccessful administration in recent history in actually bringing political appointees into the government. At any one time, I haven't looked at the recent stats on this, but it took a very long time for assistant secretaries, undersecretaries in the departments, including the State Department, to actually be appointed. And at the same time, a lot of those individuals stayed at a shorter period than most other administrations. So it's not as if the Trump administration has been able to inject its ideology and its philosophy into the cabinet departments in a permanent way. I just make that point. That's not to say that enormous damage hasn't been done. I take your point on that. But it's worthwhile thinking about this question in the context of the power of the presidency, which is inherently limited, and also the ability of the president to appoint in cabinet departments people who can inject the permanent bureaucracy with his agenda.
Michael, do you think, sorry, Jill, please.
Well, I think Colin's absolutely right. So much of what Trump has tried to do has been done by executive order. And this sort of goes to Michael's earlier point, right? You can't trust a country that changes its direction by executive order like that. There is no stability. Trump didn't start that, but Trump ramped it up an awful lot. And so to make things stickier, you need a functioning legislative system and you need a court. And right now our court is a 4-4 court. And so who knows what's going to happen, right? There's a question of how much Biden can actually do to make sticky and how much he can continue using executive order given where the court's going to be. So much is an open question that is ordinarily not an open question in an election. I think, part of the good news is that the Biden campaign has been doing pre-election planning for a Biden administration, unlike the Trump administration, right? There are people who have policies and are ready to get moving on day one. And what we saw in the last election was shocking, right? There was no, I can't use that word enough, right? Nothing was ready. There were no plans, there were no people, one of the areas was in terms of staffing. Right. There were no appointments because nobody had thought that through. I think the Trump campaign didn't think they were going to win, so they didn't do anything. That wouldn't happen this time. In a Biden administration, some jobs would get filled very, very quickly. But I don't think we've ever seen anything like this.
Michael?
I hate to keep being that guy at the party, but I do worry after this summer's decision in DHS versus Regents of the University of California, and certainly the Trump administration has seen that decision this way, and certainly plenty of better constitutional minds than mine have joined, that executive orders may be stickier than we ever thought they were. You know, Trump is viewing, in his reelection, is viewing executive orders as flags you can lay down that are much easier to plant in the ground than they are for a future president to pull up. I'm pretty sure that's not the way I was taught administrative or constitutional law when I was in law school. But it appears to be, you know, irrespective of how this 4-4, you know, becomes a 5-4 or becomes a 6-3, it appears to be where a number of the justices on both sides of the aisle seem to be headed with this kind of thing. And so it is not simply going to be a matter, I suspect, of immediately after his inaugural speech, Biden walking back into the Capitol and signing a couple dozen executive orders to undo the last 4 years, even those elements that haven't become that entrenched. So I worry that it's a very different world as far as the imperial presidency goes than it was 4 years ago, and that's with the complicity of the judicial branch in this case.
And Michael, I think you've really highlighted then the real sort of danger that if Biden comes in and starts ruling by fiat, then the idea of rule of law, the idea of institutions that are immune from politics, is just going to be thrown out the window, right? So that seems to me to be the danger of just sort of switching back, and reinforces the concerns you raised earlier, and that kind of political moral leadership role that the United States used to play, because that's what we're seeing elsewhere. People ruling by fiat, ruling by executive orders, and bypassing the other institutions of government that are meant to, or intended at least in the U.S. constitutional system and its cousins to sort of prevent those kinds of quick moves.
Think of how trivial American democracy looks if the tradition becomes, starting in January of 2021, that every newly elected president, as his first act in office, simply undoes 40% of the executive orders of his predecessor, and that's just what we expect. That becomes part of Inauguration Day in the United States.
And adds another 2 seats to the Supreme Court on top of it.
Well, sure, yeah, and adds a couple of protectorates and territories to the Senate as well. You know, splits Texas into 3 states, or, you know, depending on the party.
Right. So we're getting close to opening it up, but I just want to sort of open that question to everyone about, on the panel, this question about institutions and the fragility of institutions, both in terms of the U.S. domestic context and the signals that sends to the world, and the fragility of international institutions and multilateral institutions. So let's do a final round on that point, and then I'll turn it over to Oliver and we can open it up. I'm gonna ask Susan to start us off here.
One of the things I was just looking at, and I'm sorry, Victor, because I wanted to inject a note of optimism in this discussion. And the note of optimism I injected in my paper, and Michael and you will both remember this, is slowly and steadily behind the scenes is an evolution and a revolution in international law. Laws of state responsibility, treaty drafting, multilateral institutions keep going even when people have to do it for free. And so what I have found, even over this past summer, is an amazing conversation, a global conversation going on about such issues as sustainable development, issues of genocide, the work that we did on the Rohingya, I truly believe, in spite of the paralysis in political systems, that there, and I excuse the expression, that there are international law junkies like myself all over the globe who want to see an international rule of law, and we will not be deterred. And I think our lesson is 1930s Germany and the Holocaust. This is not something that we can be deterred by current politics. The course of history has to be towards multilateralism. Climate change is not a domestic issue. The pandemic is not a domestic issue. And so I have real hope that we international law junkies will continue our work behind the scenes. And I know that there are literally hundreds of thousands of American international law students who want that chance to work in the US as well.
Right. I would guess, for a note of optimism in this, I would also look at the protests in the US. I mean, we're seeing on the one hand, an awful lot of cynicism among young people about the prospects of government. On the other hand, an energy that we haven't seen in generations, demanding change. So, when you get the percentages of the US population out protesting the day after Trump was elected, that's pretty notable. Or in, Portland, the mothers joining arms against the police force, right? 40 and 50-year-old women are not usually who you see on the front lines of a protest, and we're seeing that. So, maybe this is a moment for change, from the streets.
I think either domestically or internationally, the measure of these movements that Jill and Susan are taking optimism from, as I do, I have to say. I worry sometimes that it's an ungrounded optimism, but I really want to go back to being an optimist. I think the measure of it in the United States is going to be the extent to which the rights nerds, the junkies, are able to create lasting linkages across demographics. So the extent to which Me Too and BLM and the Vital Center and Eleanor Roosevelt's successors and everybody else can create lasting linkages, rather than, as we saw under Reagan, sort of shouting across the chasm, where labor couldn't get along with civil rights, couldn't get along with women's rights, couldn't get along with whatever. And if what we see is a temporary coalition to knock Trump out that then dissolves into squabbling, then we're right back where we were. And likewise, on the international front, it will be the extent to which the international organizations and the international law junkies, of which Susan and I are both also proud members, can create lasting linkages with domestic civil society in the global South, with unrepresented or groups without a voice in the global North, including racial minorities, including the imprisoned, including, we could go on and on. Those bonds have to be of mutual respect. They need to be lasting. They need to be permanent, or else in the international sphere, just as in the domestic American sphere, we'll be right back where we started.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, please, Colin, and then we'll hand it over
if
to
I could
Oliver.
if I could just follow up on that. I'd just like to make a point about the American political party system, because I think it relates a bit to what Michael's saying. The Republican and Democratic parties have failed. And it is true that there's excessive polarization. And it is true that Republicans think very poorly of Democrats and vice versa. And that partisan sorting has gone on throughout American society. It is also true that about 40% of Americans do not identify with either of those political parties. They see themselves as independents. So one thing that I would look to here is at critical times in American history, there's been a realignment of the political party system, a realignment in which the political parties start to represent other groups. And I think we might be at that critical point in American history where those people who do not see themselves as either Republicans or Democrats and cannot really, but are nevertheless forced to choose, you know, are brought into the political party system in a way that has happened in the past, and which can truly represent that 40% who feel as if the system is not speaking for them, and it has become polarized and partisan. That's part of the puzzle, I think, and that also links up to the international issues that have been discussed.
Well, thanks very much, Colin. And I think this is probably a good time to open it up to questions from the rest of the audience. And Oliver, can I hand it over to you to moderate the segment of the webinar?
Thank you very much, Victor, and thank you very much, our panelists. You know, it's been fascinating, lots of food for thought for our audience as well. And I think with respect to the last discussion we had, I think the linkage between the domestic scene and the international has become very clear, partly because, you know, to have the moral authority to lead internationally, the United States of America will need to, in a way, rebuild its own democracy. I think what we see evolve and unfold in the current electoral debates and electoral process is really something that around the world has raised eyebrows about, you know, the state of American democracy and its more claims with which it has engaged and provide leadership in the international arena. So I think the two are also intimately related there. It's not only about, you know, from a legal perspective, the solidification of these international laws, but it is also the moral clout to play, yet again, a stronger role in the international community and multilateral institutions. So what I would suggest is if you could give me a sign in the chat box that you would like to come in. I think we have an amount of people around this virtual table that allows us to bring people in if you'd like to, you know, to raise a question, or you can type your question into the chat box that I could then pose to the panel. So anyone who would like to lead us off, you know, it would be great to see your face and, you know, interact with you this way. But you don't have to. You know, you can also simply type it into the chat box. So maybe I could start raising one question here that comes from Stephanie. She asked what, you know, if this panelist could speak to the impact of voters outside of the US this year. Specifically, you know, she has noticed in the news that there has been a significant rallying of Americans overseas in Israel to vote. They may meet a more coordinated approach to assisting voters in Israel with the complexity of states all having their own laws. So is there anyone who would, you know, it's another intersection of the international and the domestic, anyone who would like to respond to this, you know, the role of Americans living abroad and voting there? Michael?
I think Jill and I, as Americans sometimes living abroad, can certainly talk about this. I will say the number of resources available to Americans living abroad in 2020 is leaps and bounds above what it was during the midterm elections in 2018, and isn't even on the same planet as the limited resources that were available to us in 2016. So my wife and I vote in the state of Missouri. We have a very limited number of expats here in Bhutan, but they hail from Tennessee, California, New York, Illinois, North Carolina, so on and so forth. And as the American lawyers in the country, they turn to us for answers. 2 years ago and 4 years ago, those answers were very hard to find. Now we can find, you know, the Association of State Attorneys General has a fantastic website. Both parties are reaching out to voters abroad. And I will say, even in the state of Missouri, which is not known for its progressive take on a lot of voter outreach and those kinds of things, we were able to find answers very quickly. We were able to vote online, even as our own state attorney general in Missouri complained about, you know, the legitimacy of online and mail-in ballots. It took me 15 minutes to vote, and it took me no more than an hour to register and get certified and get everything linked up. So, I don't know how the numbers will break out. When we talk about overseas voters, we're talking about permanent expats, we're talking about government employees abroad, and we're talking about military abroad. So it's not clear to me that that will break for the Democrats or it will break red, but it is certainly a whole different universe being a permanent expat in 2020 than it was in 2016. And I will say, in this respect, a much better universe.
Yeah, I think that there's a part to the pandemic and the fact that we're all used to doing this now that makes being an American abroad very different than it ever has been. So I've already voted. I voted by fax. I could see that my vote was already received in California. I could do that pretty instantly. And it's, even though there are different state rules and it's a little bit complicated what those rules are, there are tons of resources that make it easy to do that, including just being able to get my ballot by email. And yeah, I did have to fax it in. Whether the numbers of Americans abroad makes it likely that they're going to make a difference in voting, who knows? But remember, there was only just slightly above 55% turnout in the last election, right? So, so who knows? What's been striking to me about this election is the degree to which those of us abroad can participate in campaigning. So I do text banking on my computer, and I certify I'm an American citizen and able to vote, and I can participate in a way that I haven't been able to do. I can sign up to be in the 2008 election, I was at a poll, being a poll watcher in Michigan. I can't do that work. I'm not at the poll, but I can work with lawyers to do voting work on my computer. And that probably has implications not only for how many people vote, but also for the degree of participation and buy-in into the election.
Thank you, Michael and Jill. Who would like to come in now? Who would like to either type in, a question or comment? There might be some, makes people, probably even more reluctant to contribute, this format, but, that's what we have to live with. Unfortunately, we can't be all in the room, but I'd rather prefer that. So who would like to come in? Just let me know in the chat box.
It looks like Angie Chow is raising her hand.
Hi.
Okay, great, Angie. Sorry, it's sometimes hard to see. Thank you for switching on your camera, Angie. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you to all the panelists. That was really fascinating. I didn't know if I would be able to handle this. It's causing me a lot of anxiety as an American living in Canada, but I've just been really struck by how much attention there has been in Canada on this election, and I was really surprised by that. So I was curious, is there something in particular? I mean, obviously this is like a big moment in American history, but I was curious, I mean, the concern here in Canada, is it purely based on kind of the implications of the results of the election, or do you think there are perhaps other reasons for why there is such a huge investment and attention to this? Thank you.
Thank you. Colin, please.
Yeah, lovely question. In 2008, the political science department put on a special course in association with external studies and about the Obama-McCain election, and we had a massive interest in that. At the same time, there was a Canadian election going on, and CBC did a did a piece on whether or not Canadians were more interested in the American election than they were in the Canadian election. And I was interviewed and I said, well, I think that's absolutely, I think that seems to be the case. I'm not sure what that says. Yes, I believe that, I think the world is in a state of fear and anxiety about another 4 years of Trump. I think the attention level is very high. The stress is very high. But I'd also say that I think that a lot of it has got to do with the belief that politics is entertainment. And I think that's a very depressing and troubling feature of our politics, which goes back a long time. Trump has accentuated that. But we like to see the horse race. We like to see who's up and who's down. We like to see and the Electoral College and all of this stuff is just part of that larger entertainment factor of US politics. And if I could wave a magic wand, I'd make it less interesting, less entertaining, more boring, more policy wonks talking about what they're going to actually do. There's a debate on Thursday night. I'm not going to watch it for that reason. There we are.
We will see how many people can resist watching the Thursday debate.
I think Susan wants to come. I think Susan wants to come in here,
Yeah.
Oliver.
I wanted to say to Angie, you should look at the chat where Donna Greshner said about the elephant. But I want to say, as a Canadian who's followed politics since I was a child, this is nothing new. Canada, I mean, when I was a very little child, I can remember John Kennedy's election. I mean, Canada's obsessed with this, it's part of our culture. And I think it's the fact that we share this border. I think the anxiety is higher this time, particularly with respect to the pandemic and the issue of opening up the border. But I've had election night parties every American election for almost my whole life. So I just want to say this is a Canadian obsession. We just are fascinated by American politics.
Let's not underestimate Colin's point about entertainment value, though. It is also a South Asian obsession. It is an East Asian obsession. I was living in the Netherlands during the first Obama election, and it's just so bloody entertaining. And with the exception of the occasional Italian complete parliamentary flop, there's no better show out there. And this is just fun, and it lasts a long time, and you can talk about it. And the American political parties are really great at boiling the message down, so you can pick good guys and bad guys very easily. You can map it to your own domestic politics and say, oh well, Trump is Modi, or Biden is DPT here in Bhutan, or whatever it might be. So it's just fantastic entertainment, and I'm terribly sorry to my colleagues across the border, much as Stephen Harper was a bad guy and I really enjoyed rooting against him. It didn't sustain the attention span.
All right.
Thank you.
Maybe we can bring in another question. Francisca, do you want to, would you mind unmuting?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I had a question regarding a potential Biden administration after this election, and many of the panelists have spoken to for a Biden administration, like how to recreate connections that have been lost during the Trump administration, and specifically how to maybe undo some things that Trump has did. And it just sounds to me, there's a lot of like, how do we go back to before Trump, from like my perspective, or what I've, when I've been talking to people, I'm also wondering, like, instead of going back to something that was before Trump, like, what is sort of the outlook? What can we learn, so to say, from a Trump administration, or things that have been bad or not going so well in the past, and then moving forward with a new administration, what could be the potential here? And as Colin has mentioned, that the sort of international voice of the United States has been declining, or sort of the influence has has shifted of the United States, and considering that how a potential Biden administration, what is the, instead of going backwards to old sort of connections and structures, what could we expect maybe to see differently in the future? I find that interesting.
Thank you, Franziska. Good to see you. Who would like to respond to this?
I guess I can respond domestically. I think there is no going back. I think you're absolutely right. Part of what Trump is campaigning on is kind of a last gasp of going back to some fictional 1950s world in which things were supposedly better. So I think the Biden administration domestically at least needs to deal with inequality in so many dimensions, inequality and growing inequality in wealth. We need to do something about the tax system, obviously race, education, right? I mean, we're seeing this all interacts with COVID, but right now enrollment in undergraduate institutions is way down in the US, and it's primarily down in community colleges. And community colleges are the mechanism by which people move up the class structure. And so I've read different estimates, somewhere between a 12 and a 25% decline in community college enrollment. And that is going to lead to even more inequality. So we need to focus on that. In terms of healthcare, I'm actually, I'd be happy with what Biden's going to do. I was much more for the incrementalist view than Medicare for all, because I think we've got the structure in place, a public option, going back to more enrollment and doing the things that Hillary Clinton had outlined, which is exactly what Biden would do, which is to fix some of the gaps in the ACA. Boring things to talk about, but more subsidies for certain, income bands, things like that, technical fixes for some of the remaining problems with the marketplaces is the kind of stuff that I would do. But inequality in almost every aspect of American life is something that's going to need to be addressed.
Thank you, Jill. And please remember what Colin said, boring is good, so we need more policy debates. So no worries, Susan.
And I think the same applies, as Jill said, on the domestic scene to the international scene. I think Michael would agree there's no going back. We've really got to, and I'm struggling with this. I mean, it's a great research project. I mean, what should the international system look like going forward? It's, we can't go back to the traditional post-World War system. We've got to rethink this. And Victor and I've had excellent conversations about transnational governance, and Michael said, connecting with local NGOs and addressing inequality. I think there's a major rethink that has to take place.
Mm-hmm. Michael, go ahead.
And Franziska has inadvertently pointed to one of the most inevitable causes for optimism that this panel should have, which is that nobody asked the United Kingdom's opinion when it declined. Nobody asked France or the Netherlands' opinion when they declined. And nobody's going to ask the United States how it feels about being just one player, albeit an important player in a new multilateral order. It has already happened. And we can't blame Trump for that, as Colin has said. And so on top of all of the other challenges that Biden will have, he will probably be the first president who at some point over the next 4 years will have to reckon with the fact that the United States is now just one among many. And so one way or another, we know the United States will adapt to this role. I know it will be very unpopular with many, many American audiences, domestic political audiences, but it's just the fact of life now. It would be interesting, and Susan and I can talk about this offline, about, how much this would have happened anyway, even under a Hillary Clinton presidency or, whatever. And yes, we will talk about that. But it was happening anyway. It is happening anyway. And the US has to like it or lump it. And even if they lump it, they're still going to have to end up liking it.
Colin.
Oh, I just say very briefly that I agree very much with what Francesca's saying, and I've got a sense that the Biden campaign message "Build Back Better" might resonate. I think it's a powerful message.
Thank you, Francisca, for this. Donna, you have your camera on. Is this a sign you would like to raise a question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you first for the wonderful session. I want to begin by just echoing what Jill just said about the pressing need to address inequality. I am in Riverside in Southern California, and about once a week I go to UCLA, actually, to the residential area where my granddaughter lives, and the stark contrast is shocking. You cannot avoid the poverty and inequality almost anywhere within the Inland Empire, that, Riverside County. And San Bernardino County is even worse. 5,000 cars will line up at a food bank, for instance. And that sustained level of inequality, no democracy, I think, can tolerate. And so that leads me to my question, and I guess it's a more domestic focused question. I think from where I stand here that Biden will need to expend considerable energies on addressing domestic policies before he can turn to regaining whatever place a much weaker US will have in the international forum. He will have a huge job in fixing the government, as all of you have said, because the gutting of the federal government that Michael Lewis talked about 2 years ago on the fifth risk has just amplified and accelerated since then. And that was a really shocking picture that Lewis painted for us. So what I'm hearing from some of my sort of friends, and so this is just anecdote, is that Biden's priority should be electoral reform in all of its sort of manifestations and tentacles, because if he doesn't fix that, his efforts to fix inequality, to work with BLM to deal with economic inequalities, criminal justice reform are not going to get very far because of the profound corruption within so many parts of the US electoral system. So I'd like to know, do you agree with that? Or do you think there should be another sort of priority for Biden? This, I guess, is more to Jill and Michael. But Colin and Susan, I'm very keen to hear your opinions too.
Thank you very much, Donna. And just a heads up, we are coming to the end of this session, so we have roughly another 5 minutes left. So, but you're more welcome. Should we, Jill, or where should we go first?
So I can give a non-answer to that. I can give a non-answer to that and give everybody else time to think, which is, in 2012, when we watched Obama win, I was watching Fox News, because that's the kind of guy I am. I follow Breitbart.com very closely. And on Fox News that night, the commentators, the pundits they had, were looking through the numbers and saying, we've lost people with college educations. We've lost people with incomes of over 100,000, household incomes over 100,000. We've lost women. We've lost all minorities. We've lost married men. We've lost, so on and so forth. And they said, and this was Fox News saying, this party has to retool itself. We have no future, and demography is only cutting against us. And that was the story that on the left, we all told ourselves back in 2012, that whatever was left of, let's say, the bad right, it was simply a matter of waiting it out. This was now a generational game. And we hoped that 2012 was sort of a tipping point, but certainly 2016, and definitely 2020 were basically going to, the demographics were going to take care of all of this. Obviously, that hasn't turned out the way that we told ourselves it would, nor does it look like it's going to do that anytime soon. And so the electoral reform, 8 years ago, I would have said, why waste our time? the clock is ticking. We're on the right side of history, and we're on the inevitable side of history. Now, I'm a lot more open to that kind of argument, that kind of rhetoric from Donna than I would have been even 4 years ago. 4 years ago, I would have told you this was a blip. This was a mistake, and we can come up with all kinds of reasons. There's a generation that's not comfortable with a woman president. There's, so on and so forth. But now, after 4 years of this, I'm certainly a lot more open, Donna, to what you're suggesting, which is some serious electoral reform to make sure that the system is fair and inclusive going forward.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. If we can't have fair elections, if we have districting that is completely partisan, we have no idea what people stand for.
I agree with that, but I just skeptical about what that would look like, given that so many electoral reforms are state responsibilities. I do think that mail-in balloting is here to stay. I do think that a lot of people are going to be used to that process. There's a lot of questions about how the count is going to occur. Whatever happens, however, any electoral reform is going to be dependent and influenced by the pernicious effect of the money in American politics. And until Citizens United is overturned, which is not going to happen, in my lifetime, I can see that any changes are likely to be, one, superficial, and two, quite fragmentary across the entire system.
Yeah, nonpartisan line drawing at the state level shouldn't be that hard to do. I mean, the harder question are questions like, why my vote counts for so little, because I live in a very populous place, and I don't know that we're going to see a change to that.
Independent commissions for redistricting are a terrific idea, but it's also true that the current system benefits those parties in power in the states, and that's why it's not going to happen anytime soon, in my view.
Well, it happens in some states.
Indeed, yes.
We've got, but victory is never permanent. In Missouri, we've got on the ballot this year a move to overturn our previous public referendum, which established an independent commission, and go back to the bipartisan commission, non-independent, namely, that we had before. And so that constitutional amendment, which was adopted by the people of Missouri, lasted exactly 2 years before it was put up for further challenge.
I can see Susan.
Just one final point to bring us back to foreign relations. Even though, Donna, I think you're right. I don't think that George Bush Jr. thought about the World Trade Center bombing. In international relations, you never know what's right around the corner. And even though Joe Biden may start off to be a domestic president, we've got a lot of, and the pandemic is one. I think he's going to be forced into dealing with international issues right off the bat. Thanks.
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, I think, looking at the watch, that brings us very much to the close of this session. Thank you so much, fabulous panelists. I think you've brought attention to so many issues, and I think really gave us some assurances of or some good knowledge and background information about some key issues that we're going to look for in the upcoming election. Thank you so much. Thank you for all of you, to have joined us. Victor, do you want to? Wouldn't you mind
Victor,
bring this to a close?
Victor, there's a final question in the chat, which is quite an interesting one.
Okay, so let's do this. Yeah, let me see the chat now.
The data by which the election will be resolved, and maybe I will ask the question in a slightly different way, which is that we have an upcoming session on November 13th, a post-election debrief. I'm wondering if you think the election will be resolved by the 13th of November.
I don't want to answer.
Yeah, talking about anxiety, watching the elections.
So on that note, Oliver, just a warm invitation. Thank you to the panelists in the audience, and if you continue to be interested, please join us on the 13th for the post-election. At least it'll be a post-election debrief.
Indeed.
Thanks
Thank you,
very much,
everybody,
everyone.
and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.